Why do people even like Final Fantasy IV? Whenever I read or hear someone talk about it, it's always in the perspective that it was good at the time. And sure, if you grew up with the game, you probably had a lot of fond memories playing it, especially if it was your first RPG. But is that really all there is to it? Nowadays, if I want to play a Final Fantasy game for interesting gameplay, I have better options. The same goes for complex narratives, and there are even games that do a great job of combining both. And this isn't even including other fantastic RPGs on the same platform. Despite this obvious selection though, 4th Final Fantasy is constantly being ported and remade, rivaling even the first FF in its number of ports. This game is clearly more than just a hood classic. Personally, I enjoy the game a lot too, but I also wasn't sure why I'd go back and replay it so often. Was this just another case of the simplicity? It's good because it's simplified enough for a broad audience? That was until one day, Yoshitaka Amano came to my house. I will not elaborate what happened next, but I came to the realization Final Fantasy IV is very pretty. The defining aspect and lasting appeal of FF4 may be the usage of visuals. I mean, look at these chunky goblins. Good news is that I don't think this is going to be some pretentious artsy-fartsy video where I assign nebulous emotions to random shapes and colours according to what some institution says. Your OC may exist in the white void, but video games are more than a standalone picture. It turns out you can assess visual design by actually looking at the context of the work. And I think a good place to start is the game's bestiary because it's handled a bit differently. In past games, there were plenty of menacing monsters, but there was no specific explanation to their existence. Why is there a mad pony? It could have been a mad dog or a mad cat. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see the correlation between Native American ward leaders and this medieval fantasy world. Is there any in-game lore reason as to why there are leg eaters but no arm eaters? Obviously there was no effort put into this contextual regard, of having a world that makes biological sense. This is an 80s RPGs, and you will fight these cool monsters. Though one useful way to build lore is by keeping consistency with each game. I can't tell you why goblins appear in the first area of the game, other than because D&D did it. But one thing Final Fantasy does have is a series of chosen warriors. And if chosen entities were to exist in this fictional universe, then couldn't that also apply to the monsters? Goblins, bombs, chocobos, tomberries, Sid citizens, etc. are all reoccurring creatures found in each of these games. It's not a stretch to presume that there's a similar chosen one rule being applied here, like retellings of a legend. But there are some exceptions of actual evolution and adapting to a new environment, prominently in FF4. Desert Sahagins are the new sand variant of what were once aquatic creatures. This is a simple but effective way of demonstrating contrast between enemies in each entry. Recycling these oceanic enemies works well in tandem with resource management and narrative. Although there's lots of airship travel, there's very little siege reversal, and 0 enemy encounters for commuting in general, unlike me London. This means aquatic enemies are relegated to specific water dungeons, instead of having the big blue to swim in. SNESifist games usually only had a few megabits to spare. Allocating memory was actually important. Seems a bit wasteful to use up all these pretty pixels on an enemy that's used in such a small portion of the game, though palette and number data tend to be more efficient, so older RPGs often have bestiaries like this. Enemies of this type purely add content that would have been nil alternatively. It's this or nothing, which can be good or bad depending on your priorities. Having lots of content used to be universally praised as bang for your buck, but these days it's seen as padding. I'm just noting this because FF4 wasn't even meant for the Soup, originally developed for the Famicom, yet that 8-bit game design carries over. Enemy sprites are simple and interchangeable depending on the context. This tortoise only uses 6 colours, including black and white, which wouldn't be too jarring to see in FF123. Comparatively, Final Fantasy V was made for the Soup, and its complex, visually varied enemies showcase this. Does this artistic restraint on FF4's part make it lesser? Usually the answer is yeah, it does. Pokemon Black has more detailed animations and environments compared to Pokemon Diamond. Even though they're on the same DSNUT system, no one's actively defending static sprites and slow, though in FF4's case there seems to be an intentional usage of creative limitations, particularly with narrative. Going back to our Sahagin example, there are sand and sea variants, but they're located nearby each other. The regular Sagondis are hiding in the underground waterways that flows under the river and supplies the oasis. How do I know the oasis connects to the underground waterway? Because one of its residents show up. But why are all these aquatic monsters holed up in a cave instead of the Atlantic? Maybe it's because of the giant water lizard roaming around the ocean floor. No wonder why everyone's using Virgin flights these days. Another example of ecological visual storytelling occurs at the very beginning of the game. Back in FF3, one of the final bosses was this airman. It was fairly dangerous and could even cast Meteor, casually wiping out your entire party, making you have to redo the already infamously difficult final dungeon. Squeenix knew how difficult this dude was. He's also the only Dark Crystal boss that isn't a recolor, so to take that same menace and then make it into a common mook may have dire implications. Granted, this enemy is much easier and no different from a regular goblin, yet they're observably the same. This floating eyeball is potentially a canonical variant of Airman. In this world, the threat is normalized, and there are now deviations of a final boss just vibing in the sky. FF4's world is generally more hazardous compared to previous games. FF1 was apparently in chaos, since 2020. FF2 had the Emperor's army, and FF3's world was frozen in time. But FF4 approaches this in a more ecological way. Rough terrain, caverns with powerful magnetic fields, dense rainforests make it difficult for airships to land, dwarves live in lethal lava lands with no flora, and summoned monsters have to pass through actual magma, though the general population is similarly dangerous. Children run amok conjuring mountain-bending deities. Citizens can simply turn you into a toad. Airships and underground tunnels are the main form of transport, because it's parallel to all the other insanity. Although there are some gameplay alterations due to these hazards, I think those dangers highlight more about the game's presentation since the difficulty is still relatively easy. The sealed cave dungeon isn't hard, but it's represented as this mirror maze roulette of cloned doors and traps. This could be a case where the repetition of potentially harmful objects could lead to some fatigue, because that's how it is in real life. Trying to land your airship in Toria to get to the Dark Cave can be daunting in its own way. At first you may think to fly over the forest until you realise there's no parking space. The enemies introduced in this area are fitting with this natural barrage too. These fellows add to the number of trees you're already optically bombarded by. It just doesn't end. Tree enemies are common in forest areas and have been used to indicate all sorts of tones. Ketchi is a recurring ally from the FF games, but its debut was oddly hostile? Its main gimmick would be to paralyze your party members and turn them into trees. This tree analogy is growing out of my branch. I don't know if this or that were intended as visual storytelling. I make these points based on my experience. Some of this talk about graphics can come off as pretentious without any tangible backing though. You see these meaningless theories on games all the time since art can be interpreted in many ways. It's important to present relating context when regarding subjective topics like graphical or audio elements. Otherwise, discourse would devolve into a collection of vibe checks, which may already be the case. Like watching a film in a language you don't understand without subs, and then boasting about how it's mysterious. You may not be convinced by my conclusion in regards to the enemies and environment. Nothing wrong with that, my dude. But what about the main cast? Cecil is the primary playable character. He starts off as a Dark Knight before transforming into a Holy Paladin. One thing that's interesting about his battle sprites is that they use the same shade of purple. Maybe this was just a coincidence, but consider this. There's an entire battle scene dedicated to the spiritual growth of this character. After spending the first portion of the game robbing and terrorizing townsfolk, he ends up going back to the same village he pillaged, then goes on a pilgrimage up a mountain to cleanse the darkness in his being. Almost everything about his new look contrasts his previous. The golden yellows outshine the shadowed purples, and yet some part of him still remains familiar. People don't just change overnight. You can't just look at a mirror and suddenly realise genocide is bad. I tried. His morality and justice had been building over the course of the game with each passing tragedy. Inner turmoils regarding his occupation and the assumed social stigmas concerning his fiancée. I made that sound more deep than it really was. There are only a couple lines of dialogue referring to this. Despite that, these scenes are visually conveyed in a grander manner, down to the pigment of the pixels. Battle screens in particular are emphasised to create cinematic tension between characters. Soldier Boy Teller casting every spellum he knows to take down the main villain. Edge watching his mutated parents end themselves due to their lack of humanity and entrusting him with royalty. I already mentioned Cecil having to confront himself, but what about his bro? This style of presenting cutscenes wasn't wholly new, but FF4 did use these set pieces more frequently. Two of the most notable battle screen scenes can be attributed to Edward. First having Teller savagely beating him to death whilst roasting his entire existence. The second being rather theatrical. having Edward solemnly strum to himself under the moonlight. After mourning the loss of his girlfriend, he's suddenly attacked by "Remember me?" Melody becomes melancholy, while his lost love gazes above, beckoning him to find courage. Ed's red contrasts the cold blue night and the monster, while the spirit still glows in the darkness. But if you'd like to see a further use of contrast, then Rydia presents a significant example. Before she's even introduced, we've already indirectly killed her mother and pyroed her village. Spyro the Dragon, Year of the Dragoon. Flames and bomb enemies are frequently presented in red because that's how it is in real life. Though the crimson contrasts her green hair, it's interesting how every major antagonistic force afterward is prominently depicted with a red colour scheme, even if they have no direct correlation with fire. One of the main military forces are even labelled the Red Wings as opposed to Hot Wings. If we were to take the story from her perspective, these threats would be considerably more imposing. For a child soldier, having your village ablazed and forced to battle against abominations may leave an impression, particularly if they had colours that were associated with traumatic events, because that's how it is in real life. And if this was T-rated, there would have been splodges of crimson blood too. But that's just me being sociopathic. It's my trauma, and I get to pick the colour. The last boss she's involved with before her time skip is an amalgamation of the same monsters that caused her troubles. None of this red stuff is directly explained in the game aside from the fire, but it does seem visually coded. Is it truly a coincidence that multiple antagonistic forces are depicted in contrast for a protag? In these cases, colour contrast is seemingly used to differentiate two sides of conflict. And if these cases seemed convincing, is it a stretch to believe this design sense could be applied to other aspects about the game? Because when you reach the last overworld map and notice the enemies near the beginning have returned, isn't it typical to assume that there may have been an attempt at symmetry? You're up against the same monsters, but the scenario is far grander in scope. Perhaps a reminder of how far the player has come since the first dungeon, up to the game's final moments. And speaking of how far we've come, what about the major antagonist? Golbez was frequently depicted in the similar large sprite style as the other bosses up until now, but once he turns good, he's presented in compact mode, the same as our main heroes. While the game does tell you this dude is good, it's also effective in presenting this, by making use of established visual themes and utilising them to expand on narrative aspects. The game story itself is fairly basic, though the way these pixels and colours are used in tandem with the plot may give off an exalted impression. I've been using the GBA version of the game to demonstrate my examples. There's a lot to like about the visuals, and I think this aspect is highlighted the most in the advanced version. Due to being on a handheld, the colours were tweaked to be much brighter and contrast each other more. This is fairly common amongst GBA ports since there was no backlight to see Mario detonate. Because of this, everything I mentioned earlier about the colour theming becomes more pronounced. Upping the contrast doesn't always make the game look inherently better or worse. Considering original hardware, Final Fantasy IV Advance looks fine enough when viewed as intended. But this version came out in 2005, and we already had backlit GBA models, the Game Boy Player and the DS. This isn't even mentioning emulation if you're a scandalous scurvy of the high seas and skies. Technology had already advanced enough to light the screen, so these adjustments turn immaculate. Noticeably, the battle backgrounds have been shuffled, bringing an emphasis to the foreground elements. It's not an accurate perspective of 3D space, but as with the colours, it can act as a contrast over realism. A small squiz of change may lean further to a theatrical presence, which may be fitting given the game's setting and frequent melodrama as they stance across the battle stage. The one downside is how the few environmental entities that there were no longer blend as well. I do mean a few. Final Fantasy IV has received multiple remasters and remakes, each sporting their own depicting art style. Advance was the first discernible departure in visuals, surprisingly so if you compare the hardware. Both the SFC and the GBA used 15-bit RGB colour palettes. The game's graphics didn't need to be altered. Double cases for the ports occupying stronger systems. Lesser restraints allowed artistic development. The difference is that this spotlighting serves a purpose in accessibility and narrative emphasis. Creative intent isn't as lost as much as it is accented, unlike the implications of an overhaul. This is also a side effect of why people rarely discuss the visual differences between the OG and Advance. These small presentational changes add up subtly, making them difficult to articulate, particularly without direct comparison, further affixing to the consensus that the GBA was just a portable SNES. This leaves the other major addition, the purpose of the optional post-game dungeon. The Lunar Ruins could be considered scrapped content according to this interview, along with the other 3/4 of the script that got chopped off. The advanced version was able to return some of the missing content to the initial North American release. The idea was to have characters reflect on their own actions, and overcome their own personal challenges. Cecil has to perform good deeds as a test of morality, and the healer has to cure all the little dudes. Each trial is concluded with a returning summon boss battle, one that's fitting with each char. Your main paladin goes up against Odin, sword guy versus sword guy, with light stuff. He also resides in a basement, for 2 games in a row. Maybe 3. It's not just thematically appropriate bosses. I mentioned Ed's Midnight Blues earlier, but look at this. Even this one-off character gets a send-off, healing the wandering souls of his family and friends, rediscovering his destroyed kingdom whilst this chilling ice blue snow washes over the cold ruins. They didn't have to add this cyan cryin filter. As usual, it contrasts Ed's red, to punctuate the swidaddy. Where's my lo-fi GBA compilation, you cowards? Rydia gets a similar treatment, reverting back to her child form after an entire game of fighting monsters, the government, eldritch deities, collecting cocaine. You're back to navigating these misty caves to reunite her with her mother, the one killed from the very beginning. Your bro, Kain, easily has the best trial of the 70-floor dungeon. Most people can agree that having a character be secretly mind-controlled isn't precisely Ripper, so this segment turns Kain into Jack the Ripper. Just your average bro on the streets, slaughtering civilians in the sheets. For getting ducked, getting cucked. Towards the end of the endeavour, Kain is faced with himself. Similar to Cecil, Kain has to confront the darkness within his kokoro, which is always epic. For Cecil, he simply had to sheathe his blade, but Kain has to fight a dragon. You know, because he's a dragoon. It's one of the few solo fights in the game, and it's a good test of timing. Jumping over mega flares, casting boost items to gain the slight edge and barely evade oncoming attacks. Lo-fi mode activated. Both were mercs from their kingdom, whilst being exploited to commit war crimes. It's implied they have the same love interest and are constantly at competition, as a friend or a foe. This duality between them was a core part of the story, and this finale helps round things out. And I think even the publishers knew how in-depth this aesthetic was. In Japan, there was a new Game Boy Micro release, with the faceplate featuring the boys. The Micro was already a very fashionable system. Look at this indigo hue! Look at how the white and blue blend together! Look at this box! Alright, that's enough gushing. The Lunar Ruins was a great addendum that complements the art direction and narrative respectively. FF4 would continue to experiment with different art styles with each new Portal remake. Meanwhile, this advanced release elusively showcasing the importance of story graphics. That's the video. It just kind of ends. Goodbye.